Let's talk about another Crab's Treasure, a new Souls-like from developer Aggro Crab, and this is a game that I was really anticipating, and I think that overall I had a good time with, but there are a number of issues that really held it back from being great, and I want to talk about that here. I am not going to be showing any spoiler footage, but I am going to talk about the final third of the game. I'm just not going to go into specifics. To kick things off, I want to talk about the camera. I really feel like this is the type of game that wants you to fight in an open space. Every boss encounter, except for maybe a few, takes place in an open arena in which your view is unobstructed. This makes it easy to read the boss's movements and allows you ample space to maneuver without being caught up on pillars or other environmental obstacles. Having an unobstructed view in a Souls-like is very important because cheap deaths can lessen the experience. In the rare instances where an arena is in an open area, once I was backed up near a wall, the camera greatly increased the challenge of a fight. It proved that it wasn't my friend and made it very difficult for me to dodge and move. Because bosses in this game have multiple follow-ups and can follow through when you parry, the camera cannot obstruct the player at any point because you're going to die and it is going to get really frustrating. This is also true when it comes to navigating the different areas found in another Crab's Treasure. The level design here is pretty great. Personally, I love the verticality found in the game, and there are a number of hidden paths in which you are appropriately rewarded. Once you get into tight spaces, however, the camera sucks, and it makes combat difficult, and also makes navigating these spaces while trying to avoid getting attacked a pain in the ass. The camera issues also extend to the platforming, which just so happens to be one of my other primary issues with the game. For the most part, platforming can be solid, but it only really works when you aren't being targeted and all of the mechanics work as intended. Early on, you'll unlock a grappling hook, and this becomes your primary means of getting vertical, and you have to couple this with the floating mechanic, which in my opinion is really hit or miss. One of my primary frustrations is when I was climbing on a net and I was trying to jump up to higher platforms. I don't know why this is so clunky, and it led to a number of moments where I had to perfectly position myself to ensure that Krill would jump up instead of off. When you are navigating environments and being targeted by archers, you are going to have a higher likelihood of getting hit by an archer in this game than actually making the leap. It artificially inflates the difficulty of this game and can ruin the enjoyment of exploration. There are two levels early on that really tested my patience because you're required to platform while being shot at and also land on these balloons with nets on them. And for whatever reason, grabbing onto them was really 50-50 because Krill would jump and then it looked like he was grabbing the net and then he would just fall off. This was without me touching anything, and this was really frustrating because there were other times where he'd grab onto the net and it looked like he was just running to the top of the ball, and that exposes you to the archers. There are also sponge jumps in this game, and these are also really hit or miss early on, but that's primarily because, archers are very accurate in this game. So as you're in midair, you have a dash, but if you don't time that dash practically perfectly, they will hit you. It's just insane how quickly they track. What's crazy is that once you get to the end of the game, platforming is a lot cleaner. It feels far more polished. There are less enemies shooting, and there's just overall less jank. Before I dive into the one thing that is really holding another Crab's Treasure back from being great, I do want to address the boss fights. I don't feel like there are any true standouts in the first 2/3 of the game, and I do want to reiterate that. I don't think players are going to have any real issues when going up against the majority of these fights early on, because for the most part, they're really basic and easily readable. This really complements your capabilities in the game because really all you can do is just swing, defend, parry. There's not much in terms of different weapons, although there are a number of skills to enhance your counters and adaptation attacks, and you also have the stowaway mechanic, which will help buff you, and you couple this with the different shell abilities and allows for flexibility with your builds, and you feel far more capable than most of the bosses you face. For myself, I was hoping for more of a challenge as the game progressed. Most bosses have simple combo strings, and these can be dodged or parried easily. I did like the fact that some bosses would immediately follow up your parry with another attack. That added a bit of flavor, but I felt like the bosses overall were just lacking of variety and creativity in the second phase. You would get like one or two more attacks and that was it. The boss fights found in the first 2/3 could have been memorable, but for the most part, it was just all bark and no bite. With all that being said, the one thing that is really holding this game back from being great is just how uneven the adventure feels. The first 2/3 will lull you into a false sense of security. In fact, you might feel like you're not playing a Souls-like, but don't get that twisted. This is definitely a Souls-like. You are losing resources when you die, but you also are breezing through some of these bosses, and you're also just kind of walking through these levels with little to no issues. You're more than likely dying to the camera or jank found in the platforming sections. The thing is, when you die against these bosses, you don't have to trek back to fight the boss. You have the option to respawn right outside the arena, and then you're just back into the fight. When you get hit in this game while you're healing, you don't lose that heal. In fact, you can just recover it off the ground and then use it immediately afterward. You can also unlock a skill that recovers shell damage. And because there are so many shells strewn about the boss arena, you're always going to have some type of defensive measure. It's just one of those things where I feel like the game wanted to make this challenging. It wanted to really embrace that Souls-like genre, but then it pivoted and made a number of concessions to make the game more accessible, which is something I appreciate because while the game does have its challenges, I don't think anything here is unfair, but that doesn't change the fact that the adventure really feels uneven in these first 2/3. It also doesn't change the fact that it feels like the first 2/3 lacks polish. Some of the different combat scenarios you find yourself in and some of the platforming sections just don't feel great to play through. There are more than enough moments of frustration where you just want to sprint toward the end, which you totally can, by the way, because enemies de-aggro pretty quickly. This was really shaping up to be one of those Souls-likes in which you could be underleveled and not be punished for it because of the simplicity of the boss fights. When the game tried to throw a curveball at you, it was really hit or miss. One fight has you constantly changing directions and trying to knock out the cord for a piece of equipment that the boss uses on that side. This is a gimmick fight that to me was disappointing because the amount of damage that can be done by some of the boss's equipment felt unfair because it was almost impossible to dodge. Some of that AoE was insane to me. You really had to utilize your adaptation abilities, as this was the only surefire way to tank damage and remove the plug for those pieces of equipment. Once you got into a rhythm though, it's a wrap. It really felt like, for the most part, this game was barreling toward being a relatively easy Souls-like until you got to that final third. Before I had reached that point, I thought the game was pretty good, but I also was a bit underwhelmed by what was here and was frustrated due to the various issues. And then the final third came. I don't know what happened. I can't explain this type of switch up, but the game went off the rails and it was all the better for it. The environments you encounter here make up for everything you experienced thus far. The platforming was not only polished, but fun. Enemies were challenging, featuring new levels of aggression and came equipped with new abilities. The levels found here are far more threatening than anything found in the first 2/3, and it really felt like I was playing a new game. The narrative also took quite the turn. There were a number of moments that were honestly pretty shocking, and it felt like Krill as a character really came into their own. Characters that I thought were just window dressing played a far bigger role, and I was impressed by the overall ambition. The boss fights were also far more fun, and while I don't believe they were uber challenging, what you experienced early on will pale in comparison to what's found here. We finally got multiple phased boss fights that were actually threatening when it came to damage. I had to make adjustments to my stowaways because I felt like my damage output wasn't enough. This was the first time that I looked to implement any type of strategy rather than mindlessly swinging at the boss until they fell. Trading blows at this stage was practically impossible because the damage output of these bosses was greatly increased, and some could shatter your shell with relative ease. In short, it was really good and took me by surprise, and it made me wonder where this had been the entire time. I believe that if another Crab's Treasure had scaled properly from the start, this game would have greatly benefited from it, especially when it comes to the reviews. The moment you unlock adaptations though, you have a leg up on practically every boss early on. Your damage and stagger output are greatly increased, and this can be further augmented by stowaways. I actually beat a boss far earlier than I should have, which led me to acquire a key story item that I didn't even know I had. In fact, when I got to this section and I was talking to this NPC who was telling me where to go next, they're like, you have to defeat this boss and it's going to be a tough one. And then I realized that I had beat the boss well before I was supposed to, because the adaptation ability that I had acquired and unlocked and then upgraded really made that fight trivial. I kind of saw this boss when I was like roaming the Fallen Sands and said, I'm just going to fight you and see how it goes. And it ended up only taking me like 3 tries. Even the fights that occurred afterward were way easier than expected because the game quickly makes you capable. You are constantly finding new things for upgrades. It is actually kind of insane to me about the amount of resources you find that will help you level up. And the game just didn't scale until the final third, in which it just took off into new heights. In my opinion, this was just a little too late. The best Souls-likes scale in challenge to meet the player, because as you progress through these levels and beat all the different bosses, your experience totals are going to go through the roof. Here, the game is pretty much stagnant in challenge for 2/3, and it gives you the assumption that no difficulty spike is coming. And there totally is. For what it's worth, it's really appreciated, but it's very unexpected. The game didn't just really lead up to this. It just kind of dived in headlong into higher difficulties, and it was like, go deal with it. I loved it when I got to deal with it, but I was also frustrated because after I thought about it for a while, I imagined if this game had just scaled from the start and had the type of polish that the final third of the story had through the entirety of the game, that man, another Crab's Treasure would have been one of the best Souls-likes in recent memory. It's just unfortunate because it doesn't meet its potential until the end. And while I can see people overlooking and forgiving a number of flaws when they get to that point, I just don't think it's fair to say that the game is completely absolved of all these issues because the end was so strong. The game is good, even with all of my complaints about the camera, the platforming jank, the average boss fights, and the lack of scaling found in the first 2/3 of the game, but this could have been great if the same amount of care and attention found in that final third was present through the entire run. I really feel like when you get to that end, the final string of bosses are insanely fun. In fact, there's one fight that requires you to think a little bit outside of the box and is quite possibly my favorite fight of the game. And the thing is, I can easily recommend this game to anyone who is a Souls-like fan, but I will say that a level of tolerance is required early on, especially with some of the platforming frustrations and the relatively light challenge. To me, it's weird because, seriously, you're going through this game and it's like you're under the sea, you're this small little hermit crab, and you're fighting all these different monsters, but it kind of leans itself too easily into just being like a normal average Souls-like. You're just fighting enemies and then going to level up. There's things that I really feel like it should have leaned into. It's like, dude, you're a freaking hermit crab. This is random. It doesn't make any sense. They could have had, in my opinion, just a little bit more fun to it because the writing is funny. Character interactions can be humorous and over the top, but these fights lacked creativity. And once again, I'm a hermit crab that can change shells. I felt like these were missed opportunities, and the game really tried to ease the player in for far too long. I just don't understand why, once you get to that final third and it drops you into the shit, you are absolutely playing a different game. You really get to see Aggro Crab's vision, and I really felt like this could have easily been great, and it's just unfortunate that you only got to see all that when you reach the end. And that's going to do it for this video. If you like the content, please consider sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.